What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be talking about 5 players that I think are just a little bit overvalued in Dynasty Fantasy Football leagues at the moment. Players that I might be trying to capitalize on this inflated value and get a little bit of a profit in the trade room. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and start talking about these 5 sells. Alright, so the first player that I want to talk about in today's video is going to be Zay Flowers, wide receiver for the Baltimore Ravens. Now, Zay Flowers is coming off of a season here where he had 116 targets with 74 receptions, 1,059 yards, and 4 receiving touchdowns. All of that was good for 12.3 fantasy points per game, which was good for the wide receiver 32 from a fantasy points per game perspective. Now, the problem is Zay Flowers is currently valued as the wide receiver 19 over on Keep Trade Cut. This isn't necessarily egregious, but it does feel like it's a little bit inflated when you think about the last 2 seasons for Zay Flowers. Like I mentioned, this year he was the wide receiver 32 in a fantasy points per game perspective, and last year he was the wide receiver 31 from a fantasy points per game perspective. So it feels like right now there really isn't that high of a ceiling for a guy like Zay Flowers. Now, obviously, a lot of this is going to come down to the overall opportunity and the volume that he is currently seeing in this offense. The Baltimore Ravens, obviously a very run-heavy type of offense. They did have one of the best offenses that they've had in a very long time here in 2024, but that does make it feel slightly concerning that he still was unable to reach that top 25 type of numbers, even into the top 12, where we ideally would like to see him eventually get, especially considering that some of the talent around him isn't the greatest talent. Yes, there's guys that we like a little bit, like Rashad Bateman. You have guys like Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely that are solid for tight end options, but at the end of the day, this is supposed to be Zay Flowers' wide receiver room, and it just doesn't feel like he's capitalizing too much on the opportunities he's getting. Now, a lot of this to me is because he's not really scoring a ton of touchdowns. The ADOT that he's seeing is currently only 10.4, which is outside of the top 60 in the NFL. It just doesn't feel like he's playing deep downfield, nor does it feel like he's going to be scoring a lot of points. He is more so a guy that's going to be playing close to the line of scrimmage, scoring a lot of PPR points, but at the end of the day, it's just not translating to high-end production. And not to say that Zay Flowers is a bad player in any way, shape, or form. I still think he's very talented, but at least in this current situation that he has here in Baltimore with Lamar Jackson and with this current state and the scheme of this offense, it just doesn't feel like he's really going to reach the potential that we wanted him to when we drafted him just 2 years ago. So I do think he's a guy that I would be capitalizing on selling this offseason if people are still viewing him as a top 15, top 20 type of option at the wide receiver position. Now, moving on to my next sell high, I do want to talk about Chase Brown, the running back for the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, Chase Brown obviously had a very good year this year. A lot of this was probably opportunity based, especially in the back half of the season when Zach Moss was injured and not suiting up for the Cincinnati Bengals. But this year he had 229 rushing attempts, 990 rushing yards, 54 receptions, 360 receiving yards, and 11 total touchdowns. All of this led to an average of 15.9 fantasy points per game, which was good for running back 14 from that perspective. Now, obviously, this was the breakout year for Chase Brown, and like I said, the opportunity was pretty massive in the back half of the year. You look at his opportunity share, he was top 10, his snap share was top 11, weighted opportunities, he was top 15. Really, everything that we saw was all volume based. Now, that's not to say that Chase Brown wasn't efficient. He still had some efficiency metrics that were decent. He was top 12 in evaded tackles, but his explosive rating was 31st in the NFL. His true yards per carry was 29th in the NFL. His yards per touch was 29th in the NFL. So there are some things here that kind of show that he was more of a volume dependent option and less of an efficiency option. I think this is still a very talented player, to say the least, but he is probably a guy that I'm not expecting the same type of volume to translate to next year. Now, when you're looking at Keep Trade Cut, this is a player that's currently being valued as a running back 1. He's valued in the top 12 running backs. And I think when I'm looking at the list of guys, there's names like James Cook, Josh Jacobs, Kyron Williams, Jonathan Taylor, Kenneth Walker. Chase Brown is just the name in this grouping of low-end RB1s that I feel like is the most likely to concede some touches this year, the most likely to see some regression. And so because of that, I do think he is most likely a sell. Bengals coach Zach Taylor said that he wants to get Chase Brown the ball as much as possible, but he also said that he needs to manage Chase Brown's workload. It's worth noting that Zach Moss was a part of the game plan before he got injured. He is going to be back on this team here next year, and I do believe that there is a chance, it's not fully guaranteed, but there is a chance that they go get an early day 3 type of running back that is kind of the same similar type of draft capital as Chase Brown, who was selected in the 5th round back in 2023, and I think that would also result in a little bit of less touches and less opportunities for a guy like Chase Brown. So again, there's nothing about Chase Brown that I think is overly concerning, but when I'm looking looking at these running backs in the top 12 over on Keep Trade Cut, he is the running back that I think is the most likely to see some regression in his overall opportunities. Not to say that he still can't be productive with the opportunities that he gets, but I think this is a player that I would be valuing more so as a running back 2 than a running back 1, and because he's currently being valued as such, I think this is a guy we can capitalize on that value and sell him while he's still valued as a running back 1. Now let's move on to another running back. I want to talk about Tyrone Tracy Jr., the running back for the New York Giants. This is a player who was drafted in the 5th round of the 2024 NFL draft, a little bit older, 25 years old currently as a running back, which, as we know, they don't have the longest of shelf life in the NFL. The thing is, this year he had 17 games played, 192 rushing attempts, 839 rushing yards, 38 receptions, 284 receiving yards, and 6 total touchdowns. Now, he averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game, which was good for running back 30 in a fantasy points per game perspective. The thing with this is I don't expect much improvement overall from the New York Giants offensive line. I don't expect much improvement in the overall efficiencies. This is a team that's going to be looking to continue rebuilding. I do think Tyrone Tracy probably has another year here where he can be the starter of this football team, but I don't think he is the long-term solution in this backfield. I still think he's going to be a guy who splits some touches. Overall this year, he only saw a 58.2% snap share. He was splitting carries with Devin Singletary for a good chunk of the year, only saw those 192 carries, like I said, and the problem too was he wasn't really being used in the red zone. 33rd overall with only a total of 26 red zone touches. Now, a lot of this can probably be said because the New York Giants just weren't getting into the red zone that often. Again, I don't think that that's necessarily going to change this year. I think absolute best case scenario, we're looking at a guy who maybe gets some volume, maybe gets some PPR upside, and ends up being somewhat like a Rachaad White type of running back, but I don't actually see him really getting to that type of level. I don't believe Tyrone Tracy is that talented of a running back. Where you drafted him in last year's rookie drafts, he's definitely performed above the expectations, and I think we need to capitalize on that right now when we're selling him. He's being valued in a running back market similar to guys like Joe Mixon, who obviously are a little bit older, and guys like David Montgomery, who are a little bit older. But when I'm looking in 2-year windows, or even just shorter than that, 1-year windows, which is really what you should be viewing Tyrone Tracy as a starter in the NFL, I think those guys, Joe Mixon and David Montgomery, have higher ceilings than he does for the short term. And so that being said, you probably should be flipping Tyrone Tracy for a veteran running back that's going to give you more from a fantasy points per game perspective. And if you're rebuilding, you shouldn't be holding the running back anyways, especially with this year's rookie running back class coming in to disrupt some backfields. Now let's go on and let's talk about Jameson Williams, wide receiver for the Detroit Lions. Jameson Williams, obviously a former top 12 pick in the NFL draft back in 2022. A little bit of a rocky start to his career, but last year we kind of saw the breakout from Jameson Williams. 16 games played, 95 targets, 59 receptions for 1,020 yards, resulting in 7 receiving touchdowns with a fantasy points per game of 14.1, which was good for the wide receiver 20. Now, there's no doubt that Jameson Williams definitely had the breakout, but there are some things here that I am a little bit worried about. When we're looking at some of these advanced metrics, there are things like opportunities, volume, target share that I'm a little bit worried about because he did only see 95 targets. His target share was 48th in the NFL, and this is a guy who had a ton of total touchdowns, which we know touchdowns aren't necessarily a sticky stat. He still finished top 12 in that metric. This is a big play guy. Every time that he touches the football, he can take it to the house, and I think that's what makes him exciting, and that's what makes him fun. But when I'm looking at fantasy football wide receivers, especially guys that are currently being valued highly in fantasy football leagues, guys that are considered top 20 options or top 24 options, those wide receiver 2s and above, I want to look at some guys that I can rely on a little bit more from a week-by-week basis. Not to mention, this is also a Detroit Lions offense that just lost Ben Johnson as a play caller, and as much as people love Dan Campbell, and as much as people love the talent overall on this offense, I do think that we need to credit Ben Johnson just a little bit for the efficiencies that they've had over the last couple of years. I'm not saying that there's going to be massive regression from the Detroit Lions, but there is a chance of some regression. When I'm looking in this tier of wide receivers that Jameson Williams is currently valued in, there's guys like Xavier Worthy, Jordan Addison, Devontae Smith, DK Metcalf, DJ Moore, Chris Olave. I think there's definitely some options here that you may prefer more from a volume perspective and from a fantasy points per game perspective if we're being real. So as fun as it is to see Jameson Williams get those big plays, score those long touchdowns, do all the crazy celebrations that he was doing late in the year, I think that there's definitely enough of an argument for some regression post Ben Johnson, and the fact that he's gotten into a tier here where there are some other options that I think I'd like to pivot to long term that I think could have higher fantasy football ceilings. And now let's get into my last and final sell, and this is probably going to ruffle a couple of feathers because this is one of the most popular players in fantasy football right now. It seems like everybody loves him, and rightfully so. He had a great year. We're talking about Bucky Irving, running back for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This is a player who is rapidly creeping into the top 5 overall running backs here on Keep Trade Cut. Obviously, he had an incredible year, coming in as a 4th round pick as a rookie, playing in 18 games, having 224 rushing attempts for almost 1,200 yards. He had 49 receptions for another 398 receiving yards and 9 total touchdowns. Now, all of this considered, he did average 14.5 fantasy points per game, which was good for the running back 18 overall from a fantasy points per game perspective. But like I just said, he's creeping into the top 5 overall running backs, and he wasn't even close to that from a fantasy points per game perspective. Now, we obviously have to add some context to that because at the beginning of the year, he was definitely splitting some touches with a guy in Rachaad White. It didn't really seem like until about week 10 that he really started taking off for fantasy football, and then we saw a ton of top 12 finishes from Bucky Irving. So that overall fantasy points per game perspective, it isn't necessarily the end all be all for Bucky Irving. However, as much as I like Bucky, I still think he's a player that's going to split touches. He's definitely earned the 1A role in this offense next to Rachaad White, but Rachaad White is still going to get a little bit of his opportunities. I think the red zone touches are something that's a little bit concerning. He was outside of the top 20 in that this year, and considering how good the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were this season, I think that's a little bit concerning in itself. But overall, he's been highly efficient, top 5 in true yards per carry, top 5 in juke rate, and many other metrics. But at the end of the day, when I'm looking at running backs in fantasy football, I'm okay selling everybody, especially when the price gets very high. I think for me, this is more so a process over players type of trade because I love Bucky Irving as a player. I think he's very exciting, and I think he's definitely going to be a producer over the next couple of seasons. But running backs are replaceable, and if I can capitalize on a massive value increase from Bucky Irving where I drafted him in my rookie drafts, I'm definitely willing to do that, especially if I can get into other positions that are going to have a little bit more value sustainability. And not to mention, even if you're looking for some straight up position swaps, if Bucky creeps into this top 5, which it looks like he's going to be there very shortly, you're going to be looking at him in a tier of guys like Saquon Barkley and Devon Achane, who I think are going to be much better fantasy football producers for the next 2 seasons, just based off of what we've seen in the NFL so far. So I know this is probably not a very popular pick when it comes to sells. Most people don't want to sell a guy who just did as well as Bucky Irving did this year, but I think that there's definitely an argument with where his value currently is in dynasty leagues, and with Bucky being valued adjacently to some wide receivers like Rashee Rice, Rome Odunze, AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. Yeah, you kind of see my point. I just think that the position's a little bit more replaceable, so I would be looking to move that and flip that for a wide receiver, and then I just replace the running back in this year's draft class with some of my rookie picks. So there you have it. I have a couple players that I think are overvalued, maybe some process trades. All of these things considered, those are 5 players that I would be looking to test the waters, see what the market is for them in your current fantasy football league. Make sure you can capitalize on the value that they currently have over in the general market. But if you did enjoy today's video, make sure you hit that like button. That is the best free way to show this channel some support. Also, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel. We're going to talk about later this week some players that I wish I drafted more of in my fantasy football rookie drafts last year. Probably Bucky Irving is going to be on that one. And last but not least, make sure you go join our Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with your fantasy football teams 24/7, 365. So like I said, it's free to join. There is no risk in doing that. And with all of that out of the way, I have nothing else for you guys today. So I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.